The morning of January 16, 1943, dawned gray and bitter across the frozen wasteland that had once been Pitomnik airfield, 20 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of Kampfgeschwader ZBV-1 stood beside his damaged Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, watching black smoke rise from the wreckage of 17 other transports that had been destroyed during the night by Soviet artillery fire. At 31, Weber had been flying Luftwaffe transport missions for 6 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the systematic destruction of German airlift capabilities that he was witnessing at the epicenter of the Stalingrad encirclement. The Pitomnik airfield represented the last functioning air link between the encircled 6th Army and the outside world, a tenuous lifeline that was rapidly being severed by advancing Soviet forces. Weber's Ju-52, bearing the tactical markings 1Z plus GK of the 3rd Staffel, had arrived just before dawn carrying medical supplies and ammunition for the XIV Panzer Corps, whose remaining tanks were dug in around the airfield perimeter. The transport aircraft had barely completed its landing roll when Soviet 122mm howitzers began dropping shells among the parked planes with methodical precision. The Stalingrad airlift had been operating for 63 days since General der Panzertruppe Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army had been surrounded by the Soviet winter offensive launched on November 23, 1942. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had personally guaranteed Adolf Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled forces with 500 tons of supplies daily, but the reality had fallen catastrophically short of this promise. On the best days, German transport aircraft had delivered barely 200 tons of supplies, while most flights carried less than 100 tons due to weather, Soviet interference, and aircraft losses. Weber's crew chief, Feldwebel Hans Müller, reported the damage assessment from their overnight parking position with grim professionalism. "Herr Hauptmann, we have shrapnel holes in both wings and the port engine cowling. The hydraulic system is leaking, and the radio antenna has been severed." Müller was a veteran aircraft mechanic who had served with transport units since 1938, accumulating extensive experience in field repairs and improvised maintenance. His technical expertise had kept Weber's aircraft operational despite increasingly difficult conditions at forward airfields throughout the Eastern Front. The strategic situation surrounding the Stalingrad airlift reflected the broader collapse of German fortunes during the winter of 1942-43. The Soviet Operation Uranus had successfully encircled the entire 6th Army along with portions of the Romanian 3rd Army and Romanian 4th Army, trapping approximately 300,000 Axis soldiers in a pocket measuring roughly 50 kilometers from east to west and 40 kilometers from north to south. The Wehrmacht forces required minimum daily resupply of 750 tons to maintain combat effectiveness, but the Luftwaffe's transport capacity had never approached this requirement even under optimal conditions. Oberst Fritz Morzek, commanding Lufttransport for Stalingrad, had been struggling to maintain airlift operations from bases at Tatsinskaya, Morozovskaya, and Salsk despite overwhelming Soviet pressure and deteriorating weather conditions. Morzek was an experienced transport pilot who understood the technical limitations of his aircraft and crews, but political pressure from the highest levels of the Reich leadership demanded continued operations regardless of tactical realities. His daily situation reports painted an increasingly desperate picture of aircraft losses exceeding replacement rates while supply deliveries fell far short of minimum requirements. The tactical environment around Pitomnik airfield had deteriorated dramatically during the past week as Soviet forces tightened their grip on the Stalingrad pocket. The 64th Army under Lieutenant General Mikhail Shumilov had advanced to within artillery range of the airfield, enabling systematic bombardment of German transport operations. Soviet commanders had studied Luftwaffe airlift procedures extensively, timing their artillery fires to coincide with aircraft arrivals and departures for maximum disruption of German supply efforts. Hauptmann Weber had been flying transport missions into the Stalingrad pocket since December 15, completing 27 supply runs despite increasingly dangerous conditions. His previous experience included operations during the successful airborne assault on Crete in 1941 and supply missions to isolated Wehrmacht units during the winter crisis of 1941-42. Weber understood that transport operations required precise coordination between aircrew, ground personnel, and combat units, but the systematic breakdown of German organization in the Stalingrad pocket made effective coordination nearly impossible. The morning briefing at 0630 hours painted a picture of cascading failure that threatened to completely sever the Sixth Army's air supply line. Major Wilhelm Fiebig, commanding the ground detachment at Pitomnik airfield, reported that Soviet artillery had destroyed 6 Ju-52 transports during the night while damaging 12 others beyond immediate repair capability. The remaining 17 aircraft represented less than half the transport capacity that had been available just 1 week earlier, while increasing Soviet air activity threatened to eliminate even these survivors. Fiebig was a Luftwaffe ground officer who had been assigned to coordinate transport operations at forward airfields throughout the Eastern Front. His organizational skills and technical knowledge made him invaluable for maintaining aircraft under field conditions, but the resources available at Pitomnik airfield were insufficient for sustained operations. The shortage of aviation fuel, spare parts, and qualified maintenance personnel created a logistical crisis that compounded the tactical pressure from advancing Soviet forces. The deteriorating situation at Pitomnik airfield reflected broader problems affecting the entire Stalingrad airlift operation. The Wehrmacht's Sixth Army required not only basic supplies like food and ammunition, but also specialized equipment including winter clothing, medical supplies, and replacement weapons. The limited cargo capacity of available transport aircraft forced German commanders to make impossible choices between competing priorities, often resulting in deliveries that met immediate tactical needs while ignoring long-term sustainability requirements. Generaloberst Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding Luftwaffe 4, had been warning higher headquarters about the inadequacy of transport resources since the beginning of the airlift operation. Richthofen understood that successful air supply required not only sufficient aircraft, but also secure airfields, adequate fighter protection, and favorable weather conditions. The deteriorating tactical situation around Stalingrad had eliminated most of these prerequisites, making effective airlift operations virtually impossible despite heroic efforts by individual aircrews. Weber's Ju-52 was scheduled to depart Pitomnik airfield at 0800 hours carrying wounded soldiers from the 14 Panzer Corps and elements of the 24th Panzer Division that had been holding defensive positions around the airfield perimeter. The return flight would also transport mail from the encircled forces, representing the last opportunity for many soldiers to communicate with their families before the anticipated final collapse of German resistance. Weber understood that his aircraft represented hope for men who had already begun to recognize that their situation was hopeless. The loading process began at 0715 hours under constant harassment from Soviet artillery fire that had been systematically targeting German transport operations. Wounded soldiers from various Wehrmacht units were carried aboard Weber's aircraft by medical personnel from the Sixth Army's remaining field hospitals. Many of the casualties showed signs of severe malnutrition and exposure in addition to their combat wounds, reflecting the deteriorating conditions within the Stalingrad pocket after weeks of inadequate supply. Oberstfreiter Kurt Schneider, a tank driver from the 24th Panzer Division, was among the wounded soldiers being evacuated on Weber's aircraft. Schneider had been injured 3 days earlier when his Panzer IV was disabled by Soviet anti-tank fire during defensive operations near the airfield. At 22, he had served with panzer units since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, participating in the initial successes of Army Group South before becoming trapped in the Stalingrad encirclement. The systematic evacuation of wounded personnel represented one of the few successful aspects of the Stalingrad airlift, with transport aircraft carrying approximately 30,000 casualties out of the pocket during the entire operation. However, the medical evacuations also highlighted the desperate condition of German forces, as priority was given to soldiers who could potentially return to combat rather than those requiring extensive treatment. The harsh calculus of military medicine under siege conditions forced German commanders to make decisions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Weber completed his pre-flight inspection at 0745 hours while Soviet artillery continued to bracket the airfield with increasing accuracy. The systematic nature of the bombardment suggested that enemy observers were directing fire from concealed positions near the airfield, enabling precise targeting of German aircraft and support facilities. The Luftwaffe's limited fighter protection proved inadequate to locate and eliminate these observation posts, allowing Soviet artillery to operate with virtual impunity. The takeoff roll began at 0803 hours as Weber's Ju-52 struggled to gain altitude while carrying maximum fuel load and wounded passengers. The heavily loaded transport aircraft required nearly the entire length of Pitomnik's damaged runway to achieve flying speed, while Soviet small arms fire from infiltrated positions created additional hazards during the critical acceleration phase. Weber's extensive experience in short-field operations proved crucial for achieving safe departure despite deteriorating runway conditions and enemy interference. The flight path from Pitomnik airfield to German-controlled territory required navigation through increasingly dangerous airspace dominated by Soviet fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery. The Red Army Air Force had established effective air superiority over the Stalingrad region, enabling systematic interdiction of German transport routes. Soviet pilots had developed specific tactics for engaging slow-moving transport aircraft, typically attacking during takeoff and landing phases when the Ju-52s were most vulnerable. At 0825 hours, approximately 22 minutes after takeoff, Weber's aircraft came under attack by two Soviet Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters that had been patrolling the transport corridor between Pitomnik airfield and the German forward airbase at Salsk. The Soviet pilots demonstrated professional competence and aggressive tactics that reflected improved training and combat experience gained during 18 months of warfare on the Eastern Front. Their attack approach suggested detailed knowledge of German transport procedures and aircraft vulnerabilities. The Yak-1 fighters opened fire at 800 meters range with synchronized attacks from opposite directions, a coordinated maneuver designed to prevent evasive action by the target aircraft. Weber initiated violent evasive maneuvers despite his aircraft's heavy cargo load, throwing the Ju-52 into steep turns and altitude changes that stressed the airframe beyond normal operational limits. The wounded soldiers strapped into improvised seating arrangements suffered additional trauma during the violent maneuvering, but Weber understood that evasive action represented their only chance for survival. Feldwebel Müller operated the aircraft's single defensive armament, a 792mm MG-15 machine gun mounted in the rear dorsal position. The weapon's limited field of fire and inadequate stopping power made it virtually useless against modern fighter aircraft, but Müller engaged the attacking Yaks with sustained bursts that demonstrated professional competence despite hopeless odds. His defensive fire forced the Soviet pilots to maintain greater attack distances, reducing the accuracy of their cannon and machine gun fire. The first Yak-1 attack damaged Weber's port engine and severed hydraulic lines running through the wing structure, creating immediate control problems that threatened to make the aircraft uncontrollable. Weber compensated for the engine failure by increasing power on the remaining engines while adjusting control inputs to maintain level flight. His technical knowledge of the Ju-52's flight characteristics enabled him to maintain control despite significant battle damage and degraded performance. The second Soviet attack occurred at 0827 hours when the remaining Yak-1 fighter made a head-on pass that raked Weber's aircraft from nose to tail with 20mm cannon fire. The explosive shells penetrated the transport's thin aluminum skin, causing extensive damage to critical systems while creating multiple casualties among the wounded passengers. The cabin filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electrical equipment as damaged systems began failing throughout the aircraft. Oberstfreiter Schneider, despite his existing wounds, attempted to assist other injured passengers during the fighter attack. His actions reflected the solidarity and mutual support that characterized German military units even during desperate circumstances. Schneider's efforts to help his fellow soldiers demonstrated the human dimension of warfare that transcended tactical considerations and strategic objectives. Weber's aircraft limped away from the combat area with one engine failed, multiple system failures, and several critically wounded passengers requiring immediate medical attention. The Ju-52's robust construction and Weber's skilled flying enabled the aircraft to remain airborne despite extensive battle damage, but the tactical situation continued to deteriorate as Soviet fighters maintained contact with the damaged transport. The systematic nature of the attack suggested that enemy pilots were implementing coordinated procedures for eliminating German airlift capabilities. The emergency landing at Salsk airfield occurred at 0855 hours, when Weber successfully brought his damaged aircraft down, despite failed hydraulics and limited engine power. The landing demonstrated exceptional flying skill and highlighted the importance of pilot experience in transport operations under combat conditions. Weber's crew chief immediately began assessing battle damage, while medical personnel evacuated the wounded passengers for emergency treatment. The damage assessment revealed the extent of destruction that Soviet fighters had inflicted on Weber's aircraft during the brief engagement. 27 bullet and cannon shell holes had been counted in the fuselage and wings, while critical systems including hydraulics, electrical, and flight controls had sustained significant damage. The port engine required complete replacement, while structural repairs would take several days even if spare parts were available. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille, commanding the Luftwaffe detachment at Salsk airfield, reviewed the damage assessment with growing concern about the sustainability of transport operations into the Stalingrad pocket. Marseille had been coordinating airlift missions since the beginning of the encirclement, witnessing a steady attrition of aircraft and crews that threatened to eliminate German transport capability entirely. The systematic nature of Soviet air interdiction suggested that enemy commanders understood the critical importance of severing the Sixth Army's air supply line. The broader tactical situation around Stalingrad had continued to deteriorate during Weber's mission, with Soviet forces tightening their grip on the encirclement while launching new offensives that threatened German airfields outside the pocket. Operation Saturn, launched by the Soviet Southwestern Front and Don Front, aimed to eliminate the remaining German forces in the Don River Bend while capturing the airfields that supported the Stalingrad airlift. The systematic nature of Soviet operations demonstrated strategic planning that addressed both immediate tactical objectives and long-term campaign goals. The loss rate among Luftwaffe transport aircraft had reached unsustainable levels during the past week, with daily casualties exceeding replacement deliveries from Germany. The Ju-52 force assigned to the Stalingrad airlift had been reduced from an initial strength of 320 aircraft to fewer than 140 operational machines, while crew losses had eliminated many of the most experienced pilots and navigators. The mathematical progression suggested that effective airlift operations would become impossible within days rather than weeks. Weber's personal experience reflected the broader pattern of German transport operations during the Stalingrad crisis. His 27 completed missions had delivered approximately 85 tons of supplies to the encircled forces while evacuating 43 wounded soldiers and carrying mail for thousands of trapped personnel. However, the cost of these operations had included the loss of 6 aircraft from his original squadron. While the tactical situation continued to deteriorate despite heroic efforts by individual aircrews. The intelligence assessment provided during the evening briefing at Salsk airfield painted a picture of cascading failure that threatened to eliminate the Sixth Army's air supply line entirely. Soviet forces had advanced to within 10 kilometers of Pitomnik airfield during the day, while reconnaissance reports indicated massive artillery concentrations being assembled for a final assault on the facility. The loss of Pitomnik would force German transport operations to use the smaller Gumrak airfield, which lacked the capacity to handle significant supply volumes. Oberst Morzik's situation report to Luftwaffe 4 headquarters documented the systematic destruction of German transport capabilities with mathematical precision. The airlift operation had delivered only 3,700 tons of supplies during the past week, compared to minimum requirements of 5,250 tons for the same period. Aircraft availability had dropped to 37% of authorized strength, while serviceability rates continued to decline due to battle damage and maintenance deficiencies. The statistical trends indicated that effective transport operations would cease within 72 hours. The human dimension of the Stalingrad airlift extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass the psychological impact on aircrew and ground personnel, who understood that their efforts were insufficient to prevent the Sixth Army's destruction. Weber and his fellow pilots continued flying despite overwhelming odds, driven by professional duty and loyalty to the trapped soldiers who depended on their missions. The moral burden of inadequate supply delivery weighed heavily on transport crews who risked their lives daily, while knowing that their sacrifices could not change the operation's ultimate outcome. The strategic implications of the Stalingrad airlift's failure extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to influence German military capabilities throughout the Eastern Front. The systematic destruction of transport aircraft and experienced crews eliminated resources that would be desperately needed for future operations. While the failure to sustain the Sixth Army demonstrated the limitations of German logistics and air power, the lessons learned during the airlift operation would influence Luftwaffe doctrine for the remainder of the war. The technical challenges facing German transport operations reflected broader problems affecting Wehrmacht logistics during the winter of 1942–43. The Ju-52 aircraft, while reliable and proven in earlier operations, lacked the performance characteristics necessary for sustained operations under intense enemy pressure. The transport's limited defensive armament, inadequate armor protection, and vulnerable fuel systems made it unsuitable for missions through contested airspace dominated by enemy fighters. The maintenance problems encountered at forward airfields highlighted critical deficiencies in German logistics planning and execution. The shortage of spare parts, qualified maintenance personnel, and specialized equipment made it impossible to maintain aircraft serviceability under field conditions. These limitations became particularly acute when combined with battle damage from enemy action and the effects of extreme weather conditions during Russian winter operations. Weber's aircraft remained grounded at Salsk airfield for 6 days while maintenance crews attempted to repair battle damage and restore operational capability. The delay illustrated the broader problem of aircraft availability that plagued German transport operations throughout the Stalingrad crisis. Even when replacement parts were available, the time required for complex repairs often exceeded the operational lifespan of forward airfields threatened by advancing Soviet forces. The evacuation of Pitomnik airfield occurred on January 22, 1943, when Soviet forces overran the facility during their final assault on the Stalingrad pocket. The loss of the primary airlift terminal eliminated any possibility of adequate supply delivery to the encircled 6th Army, condemning approximately 200,000 German and Romanian soldiers to death or captivity. The systematic nature of the Soviet advance demonstrated careful planning designed to eliminate German air support capabilities while tightening the encirclement. Weber received orders to return to Stalingrad on January 23 using the smaller Gumrak airfield for his final supply mission to the doomed 6th Army. The flight would carry medical supplies and ammunition for the XIV Panzer Corps, which continued to hold defensive positions despite hopeless tactical circumstances. Weber understood that this mission represented a symbolic gesture rather than meaningful military support, but professional duty demanded completion of assigned tasks, regardless of strategic futility. The takeoff from Salsk airfield occurred at 0545 hours under cover of darkness to minimize exposure to Soviet fighters that had established complete air superiority over the Stalingrad region. Weber's repaired Ju-52 carried maximum fuel load and 23 tons of supplies, representing a typical load for transport operations during the final phase of the airlift. The reduced cargo capacity reflected the necessity of carrying extra fuel for evasive maneuvering and potential diversions to alternate airfields. The flight to Gumrak airfield required navigation through increasingly dangerous airspace where Soviet anti-aircraft artillery had been positioned to interdict German transport routes. The Red Army had studied Luftwaffe flight patterns extensively, establishing predicted intercept zones where transport aircraft were most vulnerable to ground-based weapons. The systematic coverage of likely approach corridors demonstrated Soviet understanding of German operational procedures and limitations. Weber's arrival at Gumrak airfield at 0630 hours revealed the complete breakdown of German organization within the Stalingrad pocket. The facility lacked adequate ground support equipment, fuel supplies, and defensive positions necessary for sustained transport operations. Soviet artillery fire had damaged the runway surface while destroying most of the support buildings, leaving only minimal capability for aircraft operations. The scene represented the final collapse of German military efficiency that had characterized earlier phases of the Eastern Front campaign. The unloading process at Gumrak airfield occurred under direct observation by Soviet forces positioned less than 5 kilometers from the runway. Enemy artillery fire began bracketing the airfield within minutes of Weber's arrival, forcing rapid completion of cargo transfer and immediate departure preparation. The Wehrmacht personnel handling the supplies showed signs of severe malnutrition and exhaustion, reflecting the desperate conditions within the encirclement after nearly 2 months of inadequate resupply. General Feld Marshal Paulus had already begun considering surrender negotiations during the final week of January 1943, recognizing that continued resistance would only increase casualties without affecting the operation's inevitable outcome. The 6th Army commander understood that the failure of the Stalingrad airlift had eliminated any possibility of holding the pocket until a relief operation could be mounted. The systematic destruction of German transport capability had severed the Army's last connection to the outside world. Weber's departure from Gumrak Airfield at 0647 hours marked his final supply mission to the Stalingrad pocket, completing 28 flights that had delivered approximately 98 tons of supplies while evacuating 51 wounded soldiers. His transport aircraft had survived longer than most units assigned to the airlift operation, but the mathematical progression of losses suggested that even the most skillful crews could not continue operating indefinitely under such conditions. The return flight to Salsk airfield proceeded without enemy interference, as Soviet forces concentrated their attention on eliminating the remaining German defenders within the Stalingrad pocket. The systematic nature of the final assault demonstrated careful planning designed to minimize Soviet casualties while ensuring complete destruction of German resistance. The Red Army had learned valuable tactical lessons during 18 months of warfare against Wehrmacht forces, applying this knowledge with devastating effectiveness. Weber's final mission report documented the complete breakdown of German capabilities within the Stalingrad encirclement, providing detailed observations about enemy strength, friendly conditions, and tactical prospects. His professional assessment confirmed that the Sixth Army could not sustain organized resistance for more than a few additional days. While the airlift operation had failed to deliver adequate supplies despite heroic efforts by transport crews, the systematic failure represented a fundamental breakdown in German strategic planning and execution. The surrender of the Sixth Army occurred on February 2, 1943, ending the Stalingrad airlift operation after 72 days of continuous effort. The Luftwaffe had lost 488 transport aircraft and approximately 1,000 aircrew during the operation, representing the destruction of German transport capability that would never be adequately replaced. The strategic implications extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to influence German military operations throughout the remainder of the war. Weber continued flying transport missions on other sectors of the Eastern Front until his aircraft was shot down by Soviet fighters near Kursk in July 1943. His death represented the loss of irreplaceable experience and expertise that had been systematically eliminated during the Stalingrad airlift operation. The destruction of veteran aircrew proved particularly damaging to German capabilities, as training replacements required time and resources that were no longer available. The tactical lessons learned during the Stalingrad airlift influenced Luftwaffe doctrine for subsequent operations, emphasizing the importance of air superiority and adequate logistics support for sustained transport operations. The systematic failure at Stalingrad demonstrated that heroic individual efforts could not overcome fundamental strategic and tactical deficiencies. The mathematical progression of losses versus replacements provided clear evidence that transport operations under enemy air superiority were unsustainable regardless of crew competence and dedication. The human cost of the Stalingrad airlift extended beyond immediate casualties to encompass the psychological impact on survivors who understood that their sacrifices had been insufficient to prevent disaster. Weber and his fellow transport crews had risked their lives daily, while knowing that their efforts could not change the operation's ultimate outcome. The moral burden of inadequate supply delivery influenced Luftwaffe personnel throughout the remainder of the war. The strategic implications of the Stalingrad airlift's failure resonated throughout German military planning for subsequent operations on the Eastern Front. The systematic destruction of transport aircraft and experienced crews eliminated capabilities that would be desperately needed for defensive operations against increasing Soviet pressure. The inability to sustain isolated forces through air supply forced fundamental changes in German tactical doctrine that emphasized mobility and withdrawal rather than holding fixed positions. The intelligence value of the Stalingrad operation provided Soviet commanders with detailed knowledge of German transport procedures, aircraft capabilities, and operational limitations. This information influenced Red Army planning for subsequent operations, enabling more effective countermeasures against German airlift efforts. The systematic study of Luftwaffe operations demonstrated Soviet learning capabilities that would prove decisive during future campaigns. The logistics lessons from Stalingrad emphasized the critical importance of adequate preparation and realistic assessment of transport requirements for military operations. The failure to provide sufficient aircraft, crews, and support facilities had doomed the airlift operation from its inception, while political pressure had prevented honest evaluation of operational feasibility. The systematic breakdown demonstrated the dangers of military planning based on wishful thinking rather than tactical reality. The weather impact on transport operations during the Stalingrad airlift illustrated the additional challenges facing German forces during winter operations on the Eastern Front. Extreme cold, limited visibility, and icing conditions reduced aircraft performance while increasing maintenance requirements beyond available capabilities. The systematic degradation of operational effectiveness demonstrated the importance of environmental factors in military planning and execution. The command and control problems experienced during the Stalingrad airlift reflected broader issues affecting German military efficiency during the later phases of World War II. The breakdown of coordination between different service branches, inadequate communication systems, and conflicting priorities created systemic failures that individual competence could not overcome. The operational experience provided valuable lessons about the importance of unified command and realistic objective setting. Weber's personal story represented thousands of individual experiences during the Stalingrad airlift, as transport crews struggled to accomplish impossible missions under deteriorating conditions. Their professional competence and personal courage demonstrated the human dimension of warfare that transcended strategic considerations and tactical limitations. The systematic failure of the operation illustrated how individual heroism could not compensate for fundamental planning deficiencies and resource limitations. The legacy of the Stalingrad airlift extended beyond immediate military considerations to influence post-war aviation development and military doctrine. The lessons learned about transport aircraft vulnerability, logistics requirements, and operational planning contributed to improved understanding of air mobility operations. The systematic analysis of failure provided valuable insights that influenced military planning for decades after the war's conclusion. The memory of burning transport aircraft at Pitomnik airfield became a symbol of German military overreach and the limitations of air power under extreme conditions. Weber's recognition that the Sixth Army was doomed represented the moment when tactical reality overcame strategic optimism, forcing acknowledgement that military operations must be based on realistic assessment of capabilities rather than political requirements. The systematic destruction of the Stalingrad airlift demonstrated the consequences of strategic planning divorced from tactical reality.